I'm Ryan, 32 male. I live alone in a city apartment that I worked incredibly hard to afford, a quiet sanctuary from the noise of my job as a senior software engineer. For years, my life was built on a simple principle: work hard, save diligently, and be prepared for anything life throws at you. That preparation, my financial safety net, was everything to me. But I'm here to tell you how the three people who were supposed to be my biggest supporters, my own family, tore that net to shreds, thinking I wouldn't notice the single thread they left behind that would unravel their entire deception. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. In my family, there were two sets of rules: the ones that applied to me and the ones that were bent, broken, or completely ignored for my younger brother, Caleb. It was an unspoken law of our household, as ingrained and constant as the foundations of the house I grew up in. I was the responsible one, the stable one, the one who was expected to build a life brick by brick with my own two hands. Caleb was the dreamer, the risk-taker, the golden child, who was always just one brilliant idea away from striking it rich. My parents, Helen and Mark, didn't just encourage this dynamic, they actively cultivated it. They were the architects of our opposing realities. My father, Mark, was a civil engineer, a man who understood the importance of solid structures and careful planning. Yet when it came to Caleb, all his professional logic seemed to evaporate. My mother, Helen, a former real estate agent, was obsessed with appearances. She loved the idea of having a son who was a visionary entrepreneur, even if that vision consistently led to financial ruin. For them, my steady success as a software engineer was a source of quiet, respectable pride, something to mention to their friends. But Caleb's chaotic ambition was a source of excitement. He was the high-stakes game they were emotionally invested in, and I was the predictable, safe bet they took for granted. This dynamic became painfully clear from a young age. When I was 16 and saved up for my first car, a rusty but reliable sedan, my father co-signed the loan under the condition that I pay every single cent myself, including the insurance. I worked a part-time job bagging groceries every weekend and after school for 2 years to do it. The day I paid it off was one of the proudest moments of my young life. 2 years later, when Caleb turned 16, my parents bought him a brand new sporty coupe, a graduation gift they called it, even though he was still 2 years away from graduating. His insurance was added to their policy. When he got into a fender bender a month later, they paid the deductible without a word. When I asked my mom about the difference in treatment, her response was clipped and dismissive. "Ryan, you've always been so good with money. We knew you could handle it. Caleb needs a little more help to get started." That was the recurring theme: Caleb needs help. It was the justification for everything. When he dropped out of college after 2 semesters because he had a revolutionary app idea, they paid off his student loans and gave him seed money, which he burned through in 6 months with nothing to show for it. When I was saving for a down payment on my apartment, scrimping and cutting every corner, they were funding Caleb's latest venture as a crypto day trader. He'd talk a big game at family dinners, throwing around terms like blockchain, bull markets, and to the moon, while my parents would hang on his every word, their eyes wide with vicarious excitement. I would sit there quietly eating my mashed potatoes, knowing that his office was his bedroom in their house and his investments were fueled by their retirement savings. The biggest point of contention, however, was the emergency savings account. When I got my first big promotion, I decided to set up a high-yield savings account. This wasn't just a rainy day fund, it was my fortress. It was for a catastrophic medical emergency, an unexpected job loss, or a future family I hoped to have one day. It represented security, discipline, and independence, everything I had been taught to value, or rather, everything I had taught myself to value. Because I was living in a different city, and to make things easier in case of a true, dire emergency where I was incapacitated, my parents convinced me to add my mother's name to the account. "Just as a precaution, sweetie," Helen had said, her voice dripping with sincerity. "You never know what could happen, and we need to be able to help you if you can't help yourself." The irony of that statement is almost suffocating now. I was young, and despite everything, I still believed in the fundamental idea that family looked out for each other. I trusted them. I went to the bank with my mother and we signed the paperwork. The bank agent was very clear about the account type. It was a joint account, but it required 2 signatures for any withdrawal over a certain significant amount, a safety feature I insisted upon and my mother readily agreed to. "Of course," she'd said, smiling at the bank agent. "It's his money, we're just here for backup." That dual signature requirement was my personal fail-safe, the one detail I thought protected my fortress from the chaos that was my brother. I spent the next 5 years diligently building that fund. Every bonus, every tax refund, every extra bit of cash I could spare went into it. It grew to a substantial sum, a six-figure testament to my hard work and sacrifice. It was my proudest achievement, a tangible symbol of the stable life I had built for myself, far away from the financial irresponsibility that defined my family. I felt safe. I felt secure. I had no idea that the one vulnerability I had allowed, the one access point I had granted in the name of trust, was about to become the very weapon used against me. The unspoken rule was about to be enforced in the most brutal way imaginable. Ryan will be fine, Caleb needs help. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was my landlord, a typically cheerful man, but his tone was uncharacteristically stiff. "Ryan," he said, "just a heads up, your rent check bounced." I felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. That was impossible. I had automatic payments set up for everything. I was meticulous. "There must be some mistake," I told him, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "I have automatic transfers from my main checking account." "There are more than enough funds," he sighed. "Well, the bank says otherwise. Insufficient funds. Can you sort it out today? I don't want to have to charge you a late fee." I assured him I would, my mind already racing. I immediately logged into my online banking portal. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at my checking account balance. It was practically empty. A wave of dizziness washed over me. How my paycheck had just been deposited last week. I clicked on the transaction history, my hands shaking slightly. I saw the usual charges, utilities, groceries, my car payment, and then I saw it. A massive transfer from my emergency savings account to my checking account, followed almost immediately by a wire transfer out. The destination was an account I didn't recognize. The amount was staggering. It was nearly the entire balance of my life savings. I clicked over to the savings account tab. The number that stared back at me was $78.14. $78.14. For a moment, my brain refused to process it. I refreshed the page, thinking it had to be a glitch, a display error. But the number remained, mocking me with its insignificance. 5 years of discipline, of saying no to vacations, of driving a 10-year-old car, of working overtime, all of it gone. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. My fortress had been razed to the ground. My first thought was fraud. I had been hacked. Someone had stolen my identity. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed the bank's fraud department. The wait time felt like an eternity. Each pre-recorded message about protecting my PIN number felt like a personal insult. Finally, a calm, professional voice came on the line. "Fraud department, this is Sarah speaking. How can I help you?" I explained the situation, my voice cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. I told her about the unauthorized transfer, the wire payment, the depleted account. Sarah was patient, asking me to verify my identity with a series of security questions. She put me on hold to review the account activity. "Okay, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice returning. "I see the transaction you're referring to. It was a large withdrawal, processed in person at our branch in your hometown last Friday." In person, my blood ran cold. I was 300 miles away from my hometown last Friday. "That's impossible," I stammered. "I haven't been there in months. Someone must have used a fake ID." Sarah paused. "Sir, the withdrawal was processed from your joint savings account. The transaction was initiated by the other account holder, Helen Henderson." The world tilted on its axis. Helen, my mother. It wasn't a faceless hacker or a sophisticated scammer. It was my own mother. The panic began to curdle into a sick, heavy feeling of betrayal. Why would she do this? She knew what that money was for. She had been there when I opened the account. She had praised my discipline. "No, that can't be right," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That account requires 2 signatures for a withdrawal of that size. I insisted on it. It's in the account agreement." I was grasping at straws, trying to find a logical explanation, a mistake, anything other than the ugly Ruth that was beginning to form in my mind. Sarah put me on hold again. The silence on the line was deafening. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic beating of my heart. She came back on the line a few minutes later, her tone softer now, more cautious. "Sir, I have the withdrawal slip here. It does have 2 signatures, yours and your mother's." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. "I did not sign anything," I nearly shouted into the phone. "I was here at work all day Friday. I can prove it." There was another pause. "I understand this is upsetting, sir. From our perspective, the paperwork is in order. Both required signatures are present." The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, that I couldn't even form a coherent thought. My mother had walked into a bank and drained my life savings. And she had forged my signature to do it. My first call was to her. It went straight to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Helen. Leave a message." Her cheerful, recorded voice was like a knife twisting in my gut. I called my dad, straight to voicemail. I called Caleb, straight to voicemail. It was a coordinated blackout. They knew I would find out. They knew, and they were hiding. I sat there in my office chair, staring at the screen at the pathetic $78.14 that was left of my future, and I felt a wave of nausea. I sent a text to the family group chat, my thumbs trembling with rage. Someone better call me right now, I know what you did. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was an admission of guilt, a confirmation of the ultimate betrayal. They had done it. They had looked at my years of hard work, my security, my future, and decided that Caleb's latest crisis was more important. They had made a choice, and in doing so, they had shown me exactly where I stood. I was not a son, I was a resource, a backup plan, an emergency fund for the golden child. The unspoken family rule had been written in ink on a forged withdrawal slip. And in that crushing, deafening silence, I felt something shift inside me. The shock was starting to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They had left me with nothing, but they had also made a critical mistake. They had underestimated me. For the next 24 hours, I existed in a fog of disbelief and white-hot anger. I left my landlord a frantic voicemail, promising to sort out the rent, and then I shut myself in my apartment. I paced the floor of my living room, the city lights twinkling outside my window, mocking the darkness that had enveloped my life. My mind was a chaotic storm of questions and accusations. How could they? How could my own mother, the woman who was supposed to protect me, orchestrate such a devastating blow? And my father, the meticulous engineer, how could he stand by and let it happen? The answer to both questions was always the same: Caleb. It wasn't hard to piece together the likely scenario. Caleb, the crypto day trader, had probably made a catastrophic blunder. He'd likely gotten into debt with the wrong people, or maybe his high-risk, high-reward strategy had finally crashed and burned, leaving him with a massive deficit he couldn't cover. And as always, he had run to mommy and daddy. But this time, their own funds must have been tapped out from his previous failures, so they had turned to me. They hadn't asked. They hadn't explained. They had simply taken. They had viewed my savings account not as my property, my future, but as a family resource they were entitled to, a slush fund for their favored son. The thought of the forgery gnawed at me. My mother had walked into a bank, looked a teller in the eye, and slid a piece of paper across the counter bearing my falsified signature. But who had actually signed it? My mother's handwriting was flowery and distinct. Mine was a sharp, almost illegible scrawl, a product of years of typing code. It wasn't an easy signature to replicate. It suddenly hit me. Caleb, of course it was Caleb. He had spent his entire life getting what he wanted through charm and deceit. Forging my name on a document would be nothing to him, just another corner to cut, another rule that didn't apply. I could picture the scene perfectly. My mother providing the access, the legitimacy of her presence, while Caleb performed the act of casual fraud, his hand steady, his conscience clear. I replayed the conversation with Sarah, the bank agent, over and over in my head. From our perspective, the paperwork is in order. The bank had followed its procedure. They saw 2 signatures, they released the funds. To them, it was a legitimate transaction. This was the crux of their crime, the part they thought made it perfect. They would claim I had agreed to it. If I confronted them, it would be my word against theirs and my signature on a legal document. They would feign hurt and confusion. But Ryan, you signed the form, don't you remember? You wanted to help your brother. They would gaslight me. Twist the narrative and paint me as the villain for questioning their family loyalty. They had me trapped. I finally collapsed onto my sofa, the emotional and physical exhaustion hitting me like a physical blow. I buried my face in my hands, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself cry. They were not tears of sadness, but of pure helpless rage. They had taken everything, and they had insulated themselves from the consequences. They had used my trust, my love for them, as a weapon. And I was left with the fallout, a bounced rent check, and a future that had been stolen. It was in that moment of absolute despair, as I was sobbing into the phone with another bank agent, trying to explain the situation and getting stonewalled again, that the universe threw me a lifeline. His name was David, and his voice was different from the others. He sounded younger, less jaded. He listened patiently as I recounted the whole story, my voice thick with emotion. I told him about the dual signature requirement, my insistence that I hadn't signed it, and the bank's stance that the paperwork was valid. I was expecting the same corporate line, the same polite but firm refusal to help. Instead, he said something that made the world stop spinning. "I'm so sorry you're going through this, Mr. Henderson," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. "Let me pull up the scanned image of the withdrawal form for you. We are required to keep digital copies of all high-value transaction documents." My breath caught in my throat. A scanned image, of course, why hadn't I thought of that? Can you send it to me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "For security reasons, I can't email it directly," David explained. "But I can grant you access to it through your secure online banking portal. It will be in your document center. It might take about an hour for the request to process, but you will be able to view and download the PDF." I thanked him profusely, a spark of hope igniting in my chest for the first time in 2 days. This was it. This was the proof. The next hour was the longest of my life. I sat glued to my computer, refreshing the portal every 30 seconds. Finally, a new file appeared in my document center, Withdrawal Form 87B1 PDF. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely control the mouse. I clicked on it. The document loaded, a standard bank form filled with numbers and checkboxes, and there at the bottom were the signature lines. The first was my mother's familiar looping script, Helen M. Henderson. And below it, on the line designated for the second account holder, was a clumsy, awkward imitation of my name, Ryan T. Henderson. It was a terrible forgery, laughably bad. Caleb had gotten the slant wrong, the letters were too rounded, and the T in my middle initial was looped in a way I had never done in my life. Anyone who had ever seen my real signature would know instantly that this was a fake. They hadn't counted on me ever seeing the physical document. They thought their lie, backed by the bank's procedure, was enough. They assumed I would just break, that I would yell and scream and eventually accept the loss because fighting my own family felt too monstrous a task. They had built their crime on a foundation of assumptions about my character, that I was a pushover, that my loyalty to the family unit was absolute, that I would ultimately finance my own destruction to maintain a semblance of peace. And in that moment, looking at that pathetic, fraudulent scribble, I knew they were wrong. The rage didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It sharpened into a single, focused point. This document was not a symbol of my defeat. It was my weapon. It was the loophole. It was the hard evidence that would tear their perfect crime to shreds. They had left a paper trail, and I was going to follow it all the way to their front door. The despair was gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. The game had changed. They thought they had checkmated me, but they had just handed me the move that would win the entire game. The first person I called was Chloe. We had been friends since college, and while I had gone into the structured world of code, she had chosen the combative arena of corporate law. She was sharp, pragmatic, and fiercely loyal. I sent her the PDF of the forged withdrawal slip before I even dialed her number. She answered on the second ring. "Ryan, what is this? Is this some kind of joke?" I took a deep breath and laid out the entire sordid tale. The golden child brother, the enabling parents, the drained account, the phone calls, the crushing silence, and the final damning piece of evidence now sitting in her inbox. She listened without interruption, the silence on her end of the line punctuated only by my own shaky breaths. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay, first things first, don't talk to them. Don't answer their calls, don't respond to TH. Our texts do not engage. We need to control the flow of information from this point forward. They think they're in the clear, let them keep thinking that." Her voice was calm and commanding, and it was exactly what I needed. The panic that had been simmering beneath my anger began to subside, replaced by the steadying influence of her logic. "This is bank fraud, Ryan," she continued, her tone hardening. "And forgery. These are criminal offenses. We have a few ways we can play this, but before we decide on a strategy, we need more information. We need to follow the money, the wire transfer." I had been so focused on the withdrawal itself that I hadn't given much thought to where the money had actually gone. Chloe instructed me to call the bank back, specifically David, if I could get him, and authorize them to speak with her. She wanted the full details of the outgoing wire transfer, the recipient's name, the account number, and the destination bank. "They'll be hesitant," she warned, "but you are the account holder reporting a fraudulent transaction. They have to cooperate." Getting David back on the line was easier than I expected. I explained that I was now working with my lawyer, and he seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. After I gave my verbal authorization, I passed the phone to Chloe. I could only hear her side of the conversation, a series of precise, legally phrased questions. She was firm but polite, referencing banking regulations and customer rights. After about 15 minutes, she hung up. "Got it," she said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. "I have the transfer details. I'm going to run a search on the recipient's name and the LLC associated with the account." While she worked her legal magic, I had my own task. Chloe wanted me to create a complete financial timeline. She needed records of my contributions to the savings account, my pay stubs, my tax returns, anything that proved the money was legitimately mine, earned through my own labor. She also wanted me to document every single time I had given my family money in the past. It was a painful trip down memory lane. I spent the next few hours digging through old bank statements and emails. The results were sickening. There was the $5,000 loan to Caleb for his app idea that was never paid back. The $2,000 to my parents to cover a property tax shortfall that I now suspected went to one of Caleb's debts. A dozen smaller transfers for car repairs, overdue bills, and business expenses. The pattern was undeniable. I wasn't just the responsible son, I was their safety net. I was the one they ran to when their poor decisions caught up with them. But this time was different. They hadn't asked for a loan, they had committed theft. The scale of it, the premeditation, the sheer audacity, it was a declaration of war. By the time I finished compiling the documents, my anger had cooled into a steely resolve. Every number on that spreadsheet was a reason to see this through to the end. Chloe called back late that evening. "Okay, I've got the whole picture now," she said, "and it's worse than we thought." The wire transfer had been sent to an entity called Prestige Auto Imports LLC. It sounded vaguely legitimate, but Chloe had dug deeper. The LLC was a shell corporation registered just 3 months ago, the sole proprietor, Caleb Henderson. He funneled the money to himself, Ryan, she explained. He set this up to make it look like a legitimate business purchase, probably to throw you off the scent if you ever looked at the transaction. But that wasn't the worst of it. Chloe had a friend who worked in financial risk assessment. She had called in a favor. The money didn't stay in the LLC's account for long, Chloe said, her voice low. Most of it was immediately transferred out again. A large portion went to a high-risk online gambling site based in Curaçao. Another significant chunk was used to pay off a personal line of credit from a notoriously shady lender known for predatory interest rates. And the rest. It looks like he bought a car, a very expensive imported sports car. The air was sucked out of the room. It wasn't a noble, if misguided, attempt to save Caleb from some terrible one-time mistake. He hadn't been in danger. He had stolen my life savings to fund his reckless lifestyle. He had paid off his gambling debts and bought himself a shiny new toy. This wasn't a desperate act, it was a selfish one. The betrayal was so complete, so breathtakingly venal, that I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. There was no more room for doubt, no more wondering if I was overreacting. This was a simple case of grand larceny committed by my brother and enabled by my parents. "So what's our move?" I asked Chloe, my voice devoid of emotion. "We have two paths," she said. "Path A is the nuclear option. We go to the police. We file a report for fraud and forgery. The district attorney would have a field day with this. We have the forged document, the paper trail, everything. Caleb would almost certainly face felony charges. Your mother could be charged as an accessory. It would be public, it would be messy, and it would destroy your family permanently." She paused. "Path B is the private one. We use the threat of Path A to get your money back. We leverage the evidence we have to force them into a corner. No police, no courts, just a private settlement. You get your money and you walk away. But you have to be willing to follow through with the criminal charges if they refuse." I didn't even have to think about it. "Path B," I said. "I don't want to send my own mother to jail, but I want my money back, every single cent, and I want them to know that I know exactly what they did." "Good," Chloe replied. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. It's cleaner and it gives you all the power. Now, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to draft a legally binding settlement agreement. And you, my friend, are going to arrange a family meeting." The next few days were a masterclass in strategic silence. I followed Chloe's instructions to the letter. I blocked my parents and Caleb on my phone and social media. The void I created was intentional. I wanted them to stew in their uncertainty. Did I know the whole story? Was I just angry, or was I planning something? Their silence had been a weapon against me. Now my silence would be my weapon against them. Chloe, meanwhile, was drafting the most formidable legal document I had ever seen. It wasn't a friendly letter. It was a surgical instrument designed to dissect their crime and leave them with no option but surrender. The document, which she titled a pre-litigation settlement agreement, was a thing of beauty. It began by laying out the undisputed facts in cold, numbered paragraphs: the existence of the joint savings account, the dual signature requirement, the date and amount of the withdrawal, and the fact that I was verifiably 300 miles away at the time of the transaction. It then attached, as Exhibit A, a crystal-clear copy of the forged withdrawal slip, with the fraudulent signature circled in red. Exhibit B was a detailed flowchart tracing the money from my account to Caleb's Shell LLC, and from there to the gambling site, the predatory lender, and the car dealership. Chloe had obtained transaction records that were ironclad. The core of the agreement was the ultimatum. It stated that I had irrefutable evidence of bank fraud, forgery, and wire fraud. It listed the specific criminal statutes they had violated and the potential prison sentences associated with each. Then it offered them a choice. They could either agree to the terms outlined in the document, or I would, within 24 hours of their refusal, forward the entire package to the district attorney's office and the fraud division of my bank. There would be no negotiation. The terms were brutal and non-negotiable. First, the full amount stolen was to be returned via a certified cashier's check within 72 hours. Second, to account for lost interest, emotional distress, and Chloe's legal fees, there was an additional 20% penalty. Third, my parents were to immediately sign a form at the bank removing my mother's name from the account, and Caleb was to have no contact with me, directly or indirectly, ever again. Fourth, and this was Chloe's masterstroke, my father, Mark, the meticulous civil engineer, would have to sell a portfolio of stocks he had boasted about for years, his nest egg, to cover the repayment. Chloe had found records of it during her asset search. This wasn't just about getting the money back, it was about forcing them to feel the consequences of their actions in a way that truly mattered to them. They had liquidated my future, now they would have to liquidate a piece of their own. Finally, the agreement contained a comprehensive non-disclosure clause. They would never speak of this to anyone, and in return neither would I, provided they complied fully. The document was designed to be a private detonation, a controlled explosion that would sever our ties and make me whole again without the mess of a public trial. When Chloe emailed me the final draft, I read it 3 times. It was perfect. It was a cage, and I was about to invite them into it. The time had come to break my silence. I unblocked my mother's number and sent her a single, simple text message. I need to have a family meeting. I am driving down this weekend. We will meet at your house on Sunday at noon. Be there, all of you. It is not a request. I didn't give her time to respond. I immediately blocked her again. The message was delivered. The trap was set. The drive to my hometown that Saturday was surreal. With every mile that passed, I felt more detached from the person I had been just a week ago. The son who craved his parents' approval, who put up with the blatant favoritism, who kept the peace at his own expense. That person was gone. In his place was a man armed with a folder of legal documents and a heart full of ice. I checked into a hotel on the outskirts of town. I had no intention of staying under their roof. I spent Saturday night in my sterile, anonymous room rehearsing what I would say. Chloe had coached me extensively. Be calm, be brief, be final, she had advised. Do not get drawn into an emotional argument. They will try to guilt you, to gaslight you, to play the victim. Your only role is to present the terms. Let the document do the talking. You are the messenger of a consequence they created. On Sunday morning, I put on a dark suit. I wanted to look like I was attending a funeral, which in a way I was, the funeral of my family. I printed 4 copies of the settlement agreement and placed them in my briefcase. As I drove through the familiar streets of my childhood, I felt nothing. The nostalgia was gone. The houses, the parks, the old school, they were just buildings on a map, landmarks of a life that no longer felt like mine. I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house at exactly 11:59 a.m. They were all there, their cars parked neatly. I could see them through the front window, waiting. The prey had gathered. I took one last deep breath, picked up my briefcase, and walked to the front door to spring the trap. I walked into the house without knocking. The 3 of them were sitting in the living room, arranged like a panel of judges on the verge of delivering a verdict. My mother, Helen, sat perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a mask of nervous concern. My father, Mark, was in his usual armchair, trying to project an air of authority, but his constantly tapping foot betrayed his anxiety. And Caleb, my golden child brother, was slouched in another chair, a look of petulant defiance on his face. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words and guilty tension. Ryan, my mother began, her voice trembling slightly. We were so worried, you weren't answering our calls. I cut her off. There will be time for you to talk later, I said, my voice colder than I had ever heard it. Right now, you're going to listen. I walked to the coffee table and placed my briefcase on it. I opened it and took out the 4 copies of the settlement agreement. I handed one to each of them and kept the 4th for myself. I suggest you read this carefully, I said, resuming a standing position that allowed me to look down on all of them. This document outlines the situation we find ourselves in. My father put on his reading glasses and began to skim the first page. His face, already pale, seemed to lose all its color. My mother stared at the cover page as if it were a venomous snake. Caleb, true to form, tossed the papers onto the table beside him. I'm not reading that, he scoffed. Can you just get to the point? If this is about the money, we can talk about it. Mom and Dad were going to explain. There is nothing to explain, I said, my gaze locking onto Caleb's. There is only what you did. You forged my signature on a bank document to steal my entire life savings. That is a felony. You then committed wire fraud by moving the money into a shell corporation you created. Another felony, you used that money to pay off your gambling debts and buy a sports car. Caleb's jaw dropped. He looked over at our parents, his bravado instantly evaporating. How did you? He knows everything, Caleb, my father said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He had reached Exhibit A, the copy of the withdrawal form with the forged signature circled in red. He dropped the papers onto his lap as if they had burned him. My mother finally picked up her copy and began to read. A small, strangled sob escaped her lips as she saw the evidence laid out in black and white. As the document explains, I continued, my voice steady and measured, just as Chloe had instructed, we have 2 paths forward. Path A involves me walking out of this house and driving directly to the police station. The district attorney will receive a file containing every piece of evidence you see here. Caleb, you will be charged with multiple felonies. You will go to prison. Mom, you will likely be charged as an accessory to bank fraud. Dad, your inaction and potential knowledge of the crime could also have serious legal and professional consequences. I let the weight of that sink in. The room was utterly silent save for my mother's quiet weeping. Or, I said, you can choose path B, you will accept the terms of this settlement agreement. The terms are non-negotiable. I picked up my copy and began to read the key terms aloud. 1. The full principal amount is to be returned to me via cashier's check within 72 hours. 2. An additional 20% penalty is to be paid to cover damages and legal fees. 3. To fund this, Mark will liquidate his North Star investment port. Folio effective tomorrow morning. 4. Helen's name will be removed from my account. 5. Caleb will have no further contact with me for the rest of his life. You will all sign this agreement, and in return, the criminal evidence remains with me and my lawyer, and this matter is considered privately settled. Ryan, you can't be serious, my mother cried, looking up at me, her face streaked with tears. This is your family. Caleb made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but he was desperate. We were going to pay you back. Pay me back with what? I shot back, the ice in my voice cracking for a moment. With more of my own money. You emptied your own accounts to fund his failures years ago. You came to me because I was the last resort you could steal from without asking. This wasn't a mistake, it was a calculated crime. You thought I wouldn't find out about the forgery, and if I did, you thought I wouldn't have the courage to do anything about it. You were wrong. My father stood up, his face grim. Son, the money is one thing, but my portfolio, that's for our retirement. My savings were for my future, I thundered, my control finally snapping. A future you stole to buy him a car. Did you think about your retirement when you let him drain my account? Did you think about my future? No, you thought only of him, as you always have. This is the consequence. You don't get to destroy my financial security and keep yours perfectly intact. That is not how this works. Caleb, who had been silent and shrinking in his chair, suddenly found his voice. This is insane, he whined. You'd really send your own brother to prison? The person who stole my life savings is not my brother, I said, turning my full attention to him. My brother would have called me, he would have asked for help, he wouldn't have forged my name and left me with nothing. You made your choice when you picked up that pen. Now you have another choice to make. Sign that paper, or I walk out that door and you can explain your crypto trading to a cellmate. The finality in my voice hung in the air. The fight went out of them. They saw no bluff in my eyes, only the cold, hard truth. They were trapped and they knew it. My father slumped back into his chair, defeated. He looked at Caleb with a flicker of something I had never seen from him before, pure disappointment. My mother just wept. I placed a pen on the coffee table. You have 60 seconds to decide, I said, looking at my watch. After that, the offer is withdrawn permanently. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. Then, with a heavy sigh that seemed to drain all the air from the room, my father leaned forward, picked up the pen, and signed his name. My mother followed, her hand trembling so much she could barely write. Finally, Caleb snatched the pen and scrawled his name, flinging it back onto the table. I collected the signed pages, replaced them in my briefcase, and walked to the door. My lawyer will be in touch tomorrow with wiring instructions for her fees, I said, not looking back. The rest goes into the cashier's check. You have my address. My mother called my name, her voice pleading. Ryan, please don't go like this. I stopped at the door and turned my hand on the knob. This isn't my decision, I said. It's the consequence of yours. And with that, I walked out, leaving the wreckage of my family behind me. The 72 hours that followed the confrontation were the most nerve-wracking of my life. I drove back to my city in a daze, the signed settlement agreement sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. Part of me still couldn't believe they had signed it. Another, more cynical part of me waited for the inevitable betrayal, a last-minute refusal or some desperate attempt to renegotiate. Chloe was more confident. They'll pay, she had said when I called her from the road. Your father is a man who understands liability and your mother is terrified of public shame. Caleb is a coward. They're not going to risk prison. The threat is credible and they know it. She was right. On Tuesday morning, I got an email from Chloe with a confirmation slip. A wire transfer for her full legal fees had been received. That was the first sign. The real test came on Wednesday afternoon. A courier arrived at my apartment with a certified bank envelope. My hands trembled as I signed for it. I took it inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and slowly opened it. Inside was a single cashier's check. I unfolded it and my breath hitched. There in crisp official print was the full amount, the principal they had stolen plus the 20% penalty. It was all there, every single cent. I didn't feel the elation I had expected. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt quiet. I stared at the check for a long time, the physical proof of my victory. It represented the return of my security, the restoration of my future, but it also represented the end of my family. The price of getting my money back had been the final, irrevocable severing of those ties. I had won, but it was a hollow, lonely victory. I deposited the check that afternoon. Seeing my savings account balance restored to its former glory and then some was a relief, but it didn't fix the hole that had been carved out of me. The money was back, but the trust was gone forever. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding. I used a portion of the penalty money to pay Chloe a handsome bonus. She had been my rock, and I put the rest into a new, completely separate investment account at a different bank. An account with only one name on it, mine. I found a new apartment in a quieter neighborhood, and the process of packing up my old life felt therapeutic. I was shedding more than just a physical space. I was shedding the last vestiges of the person I used to be. The son who always tried to please, the brother who always gave in. There were, of course, attempts at contact. A few weeks after the meeting, I received a long, rambling letter from my mother. It was full of justifications, excuses, and pleas for forgiveness. She spoke of the immense pressure Caleb was under and how they had acted out of a misguided sense of love. She said she hoped one day I could find it in my heart to understand. I read the letter once, then I tore it into tiny pieces and threw it away. Understanding was not the issue. I understood perfectly, I just didn't accept it. Forgiveness was a door I wasn't ready to open, and I suspected I never would be. My father never reached out directly. The silence from him was perhaps the most damning indictment of all. He had made his choice, siding with his wife and his reckless son over the son who had done everything right. His silence was his answer, and I accepted it. As for Caleb, the terms of our agreement meant I never had to hear from him again. Through the grapevine of distant relatives, I heard that he had been forced to sell his new sports car. I heard that he was bitter and resentful, painting me as the villain who had torn the family apart over a little bit of money. Let him. His opinion of me was meaningless. His narrative couldn't touch me anymore. My new life began to take shape. It was quieter, smaller, but it was mine. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, poured my energy into my work, and started exploring hobbies I never had time for. I found a new sense of peace in my solitude. Chloe became more than just my lawyer. She became my closest confidant, the family I chose. We would have dinner once a week, and we rarely spoke of what had happened. We didn't need to, she understood. One evening, about 6 months later, I was sitting on the balcony of my new apartment, looking out at the city skyline. My phone buzzed with a notification. It was a market alert. The North Star Investment Fund, the one my father had been forced to liquidate to pay me back, had just taken a massive, unexpected dive due to some corporate scandal. It had lost over 60% of its value in a single day. If they had waited, if they hadn't stolen from me, a huge portion of their retirement nest egg would have been wiped out. And because they had been forced to pay me when they did, they had cashed out at its peak. The irony was staggering. In their act of profound betrayal, they had inadvertently saved their own financial future from a different kind of ruin. I let out a short, sharp laugh. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor, but it didn't matter. Their finances, their future, their problems, they were no longer my concern. I took a sip of my coffee, turned off the notification, and went back to enjoying the quiet evening. I was safe. I was whole. And for the first time in my life, I was truly free.